Let's start.
Now we'll start again. So we'll call the January 31st, 2022 Orono Town Council Committee meeting and Special Council meeting to order. Roll call shows Councilor Brenninger, Councilor Wingard, Councilor Robertson, Councilor Perry are here in council chambers, and we're joined by Councilor Osher and Councilor Gardner via Zoom. And we're going to begin tonight with the Comprehensive Plan Implementation Committee, and that's Councilor Gardner.
All right. So I'm just going to immediately turn this over. Part A is a review of the planning board reports and discussion of next steps regarding two items. First, changing the zoning of map 27-2 lots 118, 119 and 121, which is the Orono Public Library, the Senior Center, and then there's another lot connected to that. I assume I am throwing this to our town planner, who is in chamber, question mark?
Yes.
Okay, Kyle?
Yeah, so previously at council committee, we talked about the idea of expanding the village commercial by a few lots down Pine Street to include the library, the Bird Street Senior Center, and there's a small 1/10 of an acre lot that has a drainage area and a few parking spaces. This was largely so the library is looking to do an addition on the front side, could take advantage of the more lenient setback standards in the village commercial when it comes to building towards the sidewalk and the roadway. So council committee had recommended that the proposal go to the planning board for its public hearing. That happened in December. The planning board was in favor of the zone change and recommended that it come back to council. They didn't have any additional recommendations or feedback to offer, other than it seemed like a logical amendment to the zoning map. There was one public comment that wasn't really so much of a concern, it's just a curiosity, asking why the senior center was also included when it seemed that, you know, the zone change was primarily due to the library addition. And you know, we sort of went over that with all those lots being connected, with all of them being town-owned land, and none of them really fitting 100% into the intent of the medium density residential district, that it sort of makes sense to lump those all together in the village commercial and have that sort of be the cap of the village commercial on that side of town. With that, it's coming back for any additional council discussion, and the next steps, if council was in favor of it, would be to set up the public hearing at the next town council meeting.
All right, thank you, Kyle. Does council have any questions or comments about this item? Don't all rush to talk over each other at once.
Just suggest that it makes perfect sense, that I would encourage us to move forward and schedule a public hearing for this.
Yep, that would be my inclination as well, unless anyone has any objections. All right, quick and easy on that one. So the second item under the same item A, review of planning board reports. This one is in relation to the land use ordinance revision, creating a permitting process for homestays, AKA short-term rental activity. Kyle, again.
Right, so the same planning board meeting, this ordinance amendment went for a public hearing. There's a little bit more discussion around this one than the zone change. I outlined the sort of differing in planning board feedback in the report. I think this is the first time since I've been here where the planning board didn't really reach a consensus recommendation. So I know previously with council committee, when we've talked about homestays and short-term rentals, and we had a lot of meetings about that. The initial idea was to expand what types of short-term rentals were allowed in the town, so that really all types were allowed in all sorts of residential situations, whether it was owner occupied or non-owner occupied. We had originally looked at some different methods that other communities used as far as limiting short-term rentals, and I think what we arrived on was that didn't necessarily seem necessary due to the number of short-term rentals currently present in Orono, that we were sort of just trying to give people an opportunity if they wanted to take advantage of it. So, but when we went to the planning board, there was sort of a mixed bag on feedback. We had some members who were completely in favor of the ordinance and thought it made sense and didn't really present any problems, to existing residential neighborhoods, citing experiences with that short-term rentals can also oftentimes be less impactful on the neighborhood than long-term rentals. Some planning members thought that disorderly behavior problems could potentially arise. One of the recommended options that staff provided was, we recently did the rental registration ordinance amendment where we required a local agent or property manager for those types of rentals where the owner lived out of state or not in the local area. So something like that could be added to the homestay ordinance as well. For those types of homestay twos or the non-owner occupied rentals, if the property owner didn't live, in the community or the surrounding area. And then sort of the last kind of type of feedback that we got from the planning board was that some members felt that it was sort of a direct conflict with the comprehensive plan goal of providing more owner-occupied housing opportunities for families and creating more affordable housing opportunities. And I think that was primarily a concern with the homestay twos in residential districts like the MDR and LDR and FNA. And the concern there was that there's the potential for lots of people to come in, buy up existing housing stock that could be used for owner occupants and instead turn it into these short-term rental opportunities. Again, I think in some communities that has been a concern in bigger cities in Maine and all over the world. And it can also be a problem in major tourist communities as well. When we had talked about this, and I think still when you look at the existing level of Airbnbs in town and the number of calls we get by people interested in doing them, it doesn't seem like there's that much interest that it would create that big of a demand right away where, if this ordinance got passed, all of a sudden the whole housing stock in the town would be eaten up by short-term rentals. I think the initial idea with the way the amendment was written was to kind of keep track of how many short-term rentals were being done, and that if problems like that started to arose, it would give the town time to kind of respond to that and create additional standards later on if it was an issue. But that was a concern that the board raised, and I do see the potential where it sort of conflicts with that original comprehensive plan goal. But again, we're also addressing, I think, adding housing stock to the community in a lot of different ways. So I don't necessarily think those issues are tied to each other. I think you can probably do both at the same time in a lot of different ways too. So that's sort of where the planning board landed. So it's now coming back to council to sort of see what the committee feels like next steps should be, whether it should move forward, whether more work needs to be done, more community feedback, what everyone's thoughts are.
Great, thank you, Kyle. So I'm sure we're ready to have a fruitful conversation about the planning board's conflicting opinions. Before that, I just wanted to make a really quick, like before we get sucked away into another conversation, I wanted to make a really quick note of just some wordsmithing that I think there could be some confusion in the ordinance with some of the language, and this would be in the home state 2 definition, which is on both page 8 and 2. It's page 2 of the ordinance and page 8 of our packet. And the language reads, homestay 2, which means the rental of a single family dwelling that is not owner occupied, the rental of one dwelling in a 2-family dwelling in which the other unit is not owner occupied, or the rental of one dwelling unit in a multi-family unit in which all other units are not owner occupied. The way that sentence reads, I think it's saying all of the units in a multi-family dwelling should be owner occupied besides the one that is a homestay 2, which I don't believe is the intent. So that it might just need to be like at least one unit is owner occupied maybe, or unless I'm misunderstanding that.
So the intent with the homestay 2 is that you would have one or more units in a multifamily structure. You would have no owner occupants in any unit in the multifamily structure. That would be the idea in anything in homestay 2. There are no owner occupants in any of the units.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm just I was just misreading that. All right. Let's open it up for discussion. There's a lot to unpack from the planning board's meeting. Who would like to dive in?
I just have a question, and maybe Kyle, you know, how many of the homestay 2s do we have? Is it a lot, or is it?
And it's hard to say specifically homestay 2 versus homestay 1. I mean, it's hard to say exactly how many in general. I mean, we've looked at Airbnb before.
Right.
I mean, that's a primary, you know, use of that service. And we've looked, and there've been anywhere, 10, availabilities at a time. I think the last time I looked, there were 5 availabilities at a time. I think it depends though, when you're looking at what's available, is if things are booked or not booked and those sorts of things. And I mean, there are other services as well, but so out of those, 5, 10 that are available for short-term rental, that doesn't necessarily mean all of those are homestay 2s. Some of them could be homestay 1s.
Right. Well, I guess the leading question, or the question I was leading to is this becoming a trend? Is this becoming something that is happening, or do we have any idea?
So there are definitely some in town, and that's
Right.
why, and there were people interested in doing them, and that's why originally we brought the amendment and the topic for discussion forward, because the ordinance really only talked about homestays in owner-occupied single-family homes. It didn't even talk about a 2-family home where one unit was owner-occupied and the other unit was. It was just saying, you have a single-family home, you live there, you can rent out 2 bedrooms,
Right.
and they can't have access to kitchen facilities, and that's clearly not how people really anywhere were utilizing Airbnb anymore. You might get some of those, but it wasn't close to the whole picture anymore.
Yeah.
And we saw people in town already looking to do that sort of activity. We saw some people calling and asking about it. So that's why we brought it forward. There's definitely some level of interest. But whether I still don't think with that level of interest that it's gotten to be a hugely wide occurrence at this point.
Thank you.
Can you
Other thoughts?
define what the family is that is I'm just not seeing the definition. I'm seeing reference to the definition of family. I can't. find the
Right.
definition itself.
Right, so the family definition is what we use when we talk about the 3 unrelated people and the 5 unrelated people. So that would be, so this section 18-31 definitions that's Article 2 of the land use ordinance. So that definition for family, it's not on here, but it's in that article of the ordinance. It just outlines that in, the zoning districts where multifamily is not allowed, you can have 3 unrelated people, and in multifamily allowed zoning districts, you can have 5 unrelated people. So it's just saying that those same limits would apply to short-term rentals, just like they do for long-term rentals. So if you had an Airbnb in the MDR, you could rent it out to 3 unrelated people. If you had one in the village commercial or, Park Street in the C2, you could do 5 unrelated.
Do those, does that definition apply to Black Bear Inn and hotels?
No, because that's right. That's a commercial, travelers accommodation lodging type. Whereas what we were doing with the homestay, it's sort of a hybrid between a home occupation and a type of lodging. So acknowledge that it's got some type of lodging to it, but really it's more aligned with following the standards of other home occupations like home offices and home businesses. And, and that's, so when you go further in the draft, where it's amending section 18-131, it has to abide by all those home occupation standards, like limits on the number of off-street parking spaces you can provide on the site and signage and things like that.
And Jeff, both of the, there are 2 provisions in that definition that talk about multifamily units, zones where multifamilies are allowed and zones where they're not allowed. And in both of those parts of the definition, it excludes by name community living facilities, dorms, frat houses, hotels, rooming houses, all of those.
Kyle, I would personally have no problem with amending it to require homestay twos when the owner is not living in the area to have a manager. I mean, I think that was a reasonable suggestion.
Yeah.
That's consistent with what we do with other longer term rental properties, and I think you were actually the one that offered that as a possibility, and I think that was a good suggestion. I'd personally like to see us add that.
Okay.
And to add to that, so it's been my experience with Airbnbs that they have to be cleaned every time somebody leaves. So there's got to be somebody in the area that is watching these.
I think that's been our
Yeah,
experiences, that when we've encountered ones where the owner of the unit didn't already live in town
right.
to take care of it themselves, that they had someone either on site or nearby that would be right, because there's a lot more turnover,
Right.
there's handoff to cleaning. Yeah, so I think that's something that's already probably more built into short-term rentals and long-term rentals anyway. I mean, at the planning board meeting, it got brought up about with short-term rental services, I think there's more, I think there's a little more self-regulation as well. There's ratings on both sides. The guests can be rated just as well as the person renting the unit. Obviously that can't be used when it comes to enforcement or anything like that, but just something else too. So one question, would everyone be in favor of adding the local property manager just to mirror the language that we use for the rental registration piece, so those match?
I would very much be in favor of that. I don't think we should treat short-term rentals in a different way. And it also, it also dovetails nicely with the provision that would allow someone to basically have a mixed use, whether doing short-term, long-term, they're going to have a local agent either way. Like, it's just a little neater. And to that point, the planning board's discussion about whether the homestay twos in particular would have a negative impact on the housing market and that whole line of conversation. I think that I personally don't feel like I understand that conversation and I'm wary of that as well, but I don't think that we're at the point yet where we need to regulate or are ready to regulate the density of short-term rentals, you know, in zones. But one of the things that was brought up at that meeting that's a good point is that this gives us a chance to kind of look at the data in terms of what is the density and how many of these properties are there. And also just to acknowledge that, again, people, as much as it seems like the non-owner occupied, no local agent homestay 2 is almost like a little bit of a boogeyman, like, oh no, like this is going to come and take over the housing market and all this stuff. But also, this is a very unusual market, I think. And I think that I would assume that a lot of owners of properties, whether they are local or not, would be interested in perhaps going back and forth between having a longer term rental, just because of the cyclical nature of our college students and grad students. And, you know, so these properties that are short-term rentals that aren't owner occupied might also sometimes be long-term rentals. But I'm really in favor of having a local agent, but I'm not as frightened of the homestay 2 at this point. I'm curious, like I'll be interested to see the information that we can gather from passing such an ordinance and then gathering, you know, data about what actually exists out there in the housing market. I'm not hearing any objections to the local agent addition.
I think everybody pretty much nodded at the table here.
Yeah. Do folks have other questions or concerns?
Yeah, I was gonna say, the only place I could see homestay 2s being, not a problem, but more would be out of the shop.
Right,
There's
so-
properties out there, yeah.
Right, so that was one of the things, is the ordinance sort of already had this idea before about seasonal dwellings that kind of encompassed this short-term seasonal rental nature of properties in town. And that was one of the key problems that we sort of noticed early on, was that they were starting to regulate short-term rentals, you know, in town, and we might require a permit for some types of short-term rentals, but then a seasonal dwelling, you know, elsewhere in town, it's just accepted that, you know, that's just the way things are because of, you know, its location near a lake, and that's just sort of always how things were done. So yeah, it would be a way to capture those seasonal dwellings and actually label them as something as well, and not treat them differently than other types of short-term rentals anywhere else in town.
Yeah.
So our purpose in debating the ordinance language is not to limit. We have no desire as a town to limit either homestay 1s or homestay 2s. Our purpose is to purely data gathering.
So that was the initial, I mean, this goes back a while now. I think we first started talking about it a couple of years ago, probably. And I think we talked more then about what the goal was, and that seemed to be the goal that came out of those discussions. Was we went to a lot of workshops on short-term rentals that MMA was having. We looked at ordinances that other communities were creating as far as putting limits on, you know, the number of short-term rental licenses that could be issued, and out of that, I mean, it became I think the number of short-term rentals that Orono had didn't really line up with doing all of those added regulations as the, the communities that were doing those sorts of things. And it also became clear that if you do go down that road of regulating like that and needing to keep track of short-term rentals on that sort of level, it's really hard to enforce. And that was a huge problem that a lot of those communities were implementing things like that. You can only do a short-term rental X number of days throughout the year. And how do you track all that, especially when we only have one code officer or something like that. So, so I think where we landed was we want to allow the activity in general. If it starts to create issues, monitor it, and then come back with any needed changes. But I do think coupled with future changes in, potentially upzoning when it comes to allowing more housing in different areas in town, that, that could combat a lot of, if a few units did get eaten up by short-term rentals, then you'd be adding potentially more units anyway to kind of outnumber that. So I think it would probably be worthwhile to monitor it for at least a little bit to see if there is actually any problem at all.
So for me, I only had, there was that conversation with the planning board about the comp plan and the affordable housing. So help me with the, because in my mind's eye, I kind of go into, we've been dealing with affordable housing for years. And in my mind, it would be something to change, would be somebody to come and develop to probably address that. I don't see if somebody was to come in and buy something to maybe do something, make it a place to have short-term rental, that it would have any direct impact on affordable housing because it's not affordable now. So am I thinking correctly on this? Just so I can put it to sleep in my head.
Yeah, I mean, we don't get a lot of requests or calls about people looking to come in and buy whole single family homes for the sole purpose of renting them out on a short-term basis. It's usually, they're looking to do a long-term rental and they maybe want to add in a short-term component there, or maybe it's, one bedroom is rented long-term and one area is rented short-term, or, it's a more mixed-use property.
Yeah, my thought was more to the fact that the person that was on the planning board, that the comments that you've written, that thought that if we allowed this, that it would morph into this being that will make it where affordable housing is not attainable again. And just in my mind, it's like it's not attainable now.
Right. So, I mean, in some communities, it has made things worse because if you have, whatever your housing stock is, and then, let's say there's a really big city center and, you want people to be able to live there in that walkable area, just like we do on a, smaller scale. And then all of those, whether it's rental properties or owner occupied properties, whatever it is, are taken up by short-term rentals. Now, all of a sudden, the remaining long-term rental opportunities or owner-occupied housing opportunities can charge more because there just aren't as many, and so they're more in demand. So, I mean, that has happened in other places, but I think what we've seen here is the interest in doing short-term rentals isn't anywhere close to that level, and the places where short-term rental interest is, I don't necessarily think that's not going to be something that just happens overnight.
Right, and I think it's also important to remember that, well, and the planning board doesn't have this history maybe, but the whole reason that this conversation started in the first place a few years ago basically was that we're trying to make something that's already happening legal. There are lots of local residents who own properties that have, a duplex, or they have purchased a falling down house and they rehabbed it, and they're already operating them as Airbnbs or VRBOs. And you know, so it started as just trying to take a local economic opportunity that was sort of already happening that wasn't quite legal and making it legal. So far, it doesn't seem like we have a large stock of out of state entities buying up Orono properties and turning them into Airbnbs. But this would definitely give us an opportunity to know what's going on as it's happening. Other folks have any additional questions or concerns about this item? So Kyle, to add the local agent requirement to homestay 2, does that necessitate another trip to the planning board or to public hearing?
No, that could be added. The only reason I didn't put it in, like sometimes the planning board makes recommendations and I just put it right in. I wasn't sure how the conversation would go, so I figured I'd just wait, but I think that could be added in just prior to the council public hearing.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that because that's really more of a council policy than a planning board area anyway.
So we'll
So
move it on to public hearing.
Yeah. All right. We have an item B. The last item for this committee is a general planning project update, which is very mysterious, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it. Kyle.
Sure, so there are just a few sort of things that we've talked about in the past that probably aren't ready for their own full conversations, but just to provide a little update to council on where we're at, to let you know that it's being worked on and you know, we'll be coming forward in the future at some point. So first is an update on the town-owned land in the Sailor neighborhood. You know, been talking about it on and off for a while. You know, we did the community outreach to get some feedback there with differing opinions amongst that neighborhood about what that could potentially be used for. At this point, we reached out to the town engineer to do some kind of preliminary analysis work on that town-owned piece of land to see what might be feasible and what might not be feasible, or what our next steps would need to be to determine what would be feasible. So I think where Mandy's at right now is doing some data collection and putting together a report with recommendations for next steps that she can provide to us, and we can start to move forward and get some more formal direction there to see what the next steps would be. I know in talking to her, I think one big thing that would probably have to happen early on is wetlands delineation of that property, just to get an idea of what areas would actually be buildable, and if that, you know, the area that we had initially thought of, if, you know, the dead end streets there were ever connected, is that actually buildable, since there are some pretty wet areas on that lot. So that's where we are with that, just waiting for that feedback, and once we get that back, be able to provide a more in-depth report to council, I think, and get a better idea of where to go forward. Second was a little under a year ago, we brought the OBC lot to council committee to talk about a potential zone change for their lot. That was one of the lots that was marked on the town zoning map as being ripe for a contractor conditional zone change, since it was a former industrial use, and it's located in the MDR. So, you know, that commercial use of the property is a non-conforming use currently. So we brought the idea with Abe and Heather Forward, they were looking at potential expansion in the future, I think, to build some more storage space on their lot. And they really wanted that to be a conforming use and to make that process of expanding easier going forward. Because when you get into non-conforming use, it makes it difficult to create any sort of expansion. So that was sort of put on the side for a little bit as a few other projects came up, and they weren't really looking at any immediate start dates for expansion. But we are looking to bring that back in the next sort of recent future, to talk about and bring a draft for a conditional zone change for that lot to council for review. And it would probably be a simple process that would aim to let them kind of create the expansion that they wanted to, but put a limit on the types of commercial uses that would be allowed there. So it would have to, change the zone to probably a C1 type zone, but obviously you'd want to prevent certain types of uses there, things like, marijuana establishments, which, the town specifically kind of want it designated in certain places. You don't want to just change the zone outright and just allow all of that sort of things to go right there. So that'll be coming forward shortly. And then finally, the university, I think, got a grant and is looking to do a project around their athletic fields. There have been some, I think, articles that have come out. So we just wanted, we don't usually bring projects that are going to the planning board to council at this stage, but because I think some members of public have been aware of it and might just bring up questions or for discussion, we want to bring up that that's coming up and it will be going, at least part of it will be going to the planning board. I think in this first phase they're looking at redeveloping a few of the facilities there, the women's soccer field and field hockey and softball fields. So when it comes to university projects, only those that are within, for some uses, only those within 500 feet of College Ave or the university district boundary have to go to the planning board for review. If you're beyond that 500 feet, it requires a permit through code enforcement. So the soccer field portion of that project would have to go to the planning board and the neighborhood will get notified of that. So if anyone receives any questions on that, they can be let know that that's the process that they'll go through. Other than that, I think that's all we have.
All right. Thank you, Kyle. And with that, I will turn the invisible microphone over to Councilor Grenier for community development.
Great. So on tonight's agenda, we're going to talk about staff presentation regarding the town's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. You all should have received a staff report. Understanding this is very, very draft. It's the draftiest of drafts. So it's the beginning stages.
So my goal tonight is, first, I'm hoping that Jeff and Lori will appear on the screen. My goal tonight is to walk you through the high level of the report. I welcome any feedback after folks have a chance to actually look at it before it gets posted. My team, our library director, Lori Carpenter, and public safety director, Jeff Lowe, and Belle Ryder, and I would be the senior DEI team within the town, and we're all here. This report is meant to give you a basis along with the ad hoc DEI committee report and any other work that you all have done either together or individually, to think about and come back next week to actually talk about our next steps is the goal here. So tonight is not about solving issues. It's about giving you what we think is a pretty comprehensive look at what we think our strengths and weaknesses threats and opportunities are and what we're currently doing. And at the bottom, I have proposed some next steps, and perhaps I've gotten a little far ahead of myself with council, but I thought I'd rather have you rein me in than have to kick me forward. The way we've set up this evening is Jeff is kind of going to be the person front and center to talk about the report, and then I'm happy to talk about what I think next steps are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. So yeah, this is the report that the council had requested where we go back and evaluate the town operations and see what we are and we aren't doing, or at least see what we are doing in terms of DEI initiatives. So what I'll do is I'll just go over some of the high points in the report. There's a lot of bullets throughout the whole report. I'll hit some of the high points, talk about some of the challenges and stuff like that. So as I said, this is a result of the council requesting us to go back and evaluate our initiatives. Instead of reinventing the wheel, what I did is I looked for a tool that we could use to copy in town and ask questions from and those types of things. And really there wasn't a good tool out there that I could find that would meet what we perceive to be the council's directive and fit the bill for what we need when we're assessing individual departments and whatnot. And I happened to stumble across the tool used by the city of Austin. And that was done, you can see in the report here, that was done in conjunction with the Dell Medical School there through the University of Texas. And basically what they did is they came up with a SWOT format that they used for their internal departments in Austin, not all of them, but some of them. More of the forward-facing departments that deal with things like the library or community outreach, parks and recreation, those types of programs. So what I did is I took their draft package, because it's, last I checked, it was still being formatted. I used the tools that they had in there and I applied it to the research that we were trying to do in the community to answer the council's questions. There were 5 specific areas that we looked at, and those are outlined on the front page of that report under the method that we used. The 5 areas we're looking at: organizational commitment, leadership and governance, equity policies and implementation practices, service-based equity, municipal workforce composition, and community collaboration. If I remember correctly, those were also covered in the report put forward by the ad hoc DEI committee. So I thought it was important to marry up what we were doing internally with some of the things that that ad hoc committee had also looked at. So that's where I focused a fair amount of the effort at. I did go out and I reached out to all of the primary department managers. I talked to police. Of course, I already have my own insight into fire. I talked with the town clerk, talked to Parks and Rec, economic development, public works, and basically got a general sense for where they were, what they were perceived, or what they perceived they were doing, areas that they thought they could improve, and those types of things. I did ask key questions as I went down through. There are some departments that are doing more than others. For instance, the library is definitely a standout department in addressing a lot of these, a lot of the issues or areas that we should be looking at. And I'm not sure that the library is doing that for any particular reason other than that's what the library does, to make sure that people have a good experience and everybody's needs are accounted for to the best of their ability. And they're able to go that additional mile. I will tell you that Parks and Rec also has some quiet resources available to make sure that people have opportunities, even if they are socially, economically depressed or don't have the same opportunities as others. So there are things that are occurring behind the scenes that aren't necessarily seen by the public, or aren't touted, if you will, as, hey, look at us, these are things that we're doing. Some of that goes into the strengths that we have, or is spelled out in the strengths that we have, and that we as leadership within the community or within the town governance, I should say, are very open to change. And we are very open to teamwork. And we're very open to hearing new ideas. And I think in general, as you go down through those bullets, you'll see that whatever the direction is, or whatever the decisions are made by the council, the pushback that might be perceived or whatever by the public or by other groups probably won't be there. We definitely want to provide service that is inclusive. We want to provide service that is fair. We want to make sure that people have equal access, whatever challenges they are facing. And that was echoed throughout. There's no belief that the services that we are providing are absolutely solidly 100% good. They are good. We believe that, but we also know that there's opportunity for improvement throughout the whole organization. And we're willing to explore that, and we're willing to hear how we can do better. And I think, like I said, in those bullets around strength, that really it resonates. Are we out front in declaring all the things that we do that are DEI related? Absolutely not. And part of that goes to our weaknesses, and I'll talk about those in just a second. But certainly when you look at things like creating a safe space, meaning that, we may not agree, but we're willing to accept, embracing teamwork, willingness to do the hard work. And I think as we go through, we'll see that as we learn about DEI and we're challenged on some of our beliefs and our biases that we may not even know we have to have that mindset, which is we're willing to listen and we're willing to engage. And I think that is the common message from every department manager. And as long as we have that common message amongst ourselves, then it's something that we can push down to the line staff and get buy-in. So in the results, I'm very optimistic that wherever this goes, we're ready to jump on board and make sure we're meeting needs and desires and those types of things. We expect it'll be hard, but nothing worthwhile is ever truly easy. So, to coin an old phrase, if you will, or a partial old phrase. In weaknesses, we definitely have a lack of understanding globally what all the issues are and how they directly relate to us. And I think what you're seeing is you're seeing a transition point between old school mentality and theory and new school belief, if you will, in the way that things should be run or managed or organized. For example, I have a graduate degree in business, and Sophie has a graduate degree in public administration. And when we went through those programs, we were taught that when you administer municipal service or projects for the public or whatever, you treat everybody equally and fairly. There was no look at things like equity. There was no look at how to serve underprivileged sections of your community or those types of things. They were talked about, but they were never really focused on. So we have, and the other department managers have, a belief that our mission for the longest time has been to make sure that we are providing service equally and fairly and those types of things. Now, through the course of business, for example, in the city clerk's office, they understand that there are people that come in with language barriers. There are people that come in with foreign documents. There are people that come in from foreign nations that want to get married in the town of Orono. And they have realized that they need to put procedures in place that will allow them to make those things happen. In public safety, I'll use EMS or the fire department. We don't see that type of experience. We understand that we may deal with people who have hearing issues or speaking issues, and we have to accommodate them. We don't necessarily consider, or haven't until recently considered, the transgender population and what types of psychological components that they may be going through. We haven't considered how medications that they are on may affect them medically. And those are things that we're just starting to build through now because they have come to light, and we realize that those are areas that have to be addressed, especially in a community. Well, regardless, I mean, that's how you treat people appropriately. but we want to make sure that the community knows that we're looking out for those things. So I think a lack of awareness, that less than optimal understanding of exactly what privilege, equity, and entitlement is. And we definitely do not have any systems in place to identify or prevent unintentional structural bias. That's an area that we need to work on. And when I talk about that, I think about employing people in the fire department. In the past, we've always had a requirement that says that you have to be an EMT to be employed there. Well, if I have somebody that doesn't have the financial resources to go and get that certification before they apply, then I can't consider them an eligible candidate. So I think that there's a potential to exclude people from there. Likewise, if there's a single parent who's at home all the time and really wants to pursue this career field, within reason, there should be opportunities for them to do that. So I think it's incumbent of us to almost run two tracks, if you will, to make sure that people who want opportunities have a fair shake at acquiring a job in the fire department. We definitely, again, have not formally communicated our efforts to be more inclusive and diverse. Since I've come to Orono in the last 4 years, I've had more training on diversity and inclusion than I have in my entire 21 or 22 previous years in public safety. And it really kind of shocks me. When I worked in Auburn, we had some core training around the Somali population that had moved into Lewiston because we did interact with them a fair amount. But we had no training on the other cultures that were there, or people from other countries, and that was truly a missed opportunity. And we don't want to see that type of thing happening here in Orono. So we do train, law enforcement trains pretty consistently in de-escalation techniques and those types of things, but we don't tout it. And again, that goes back to the belief that I talked about before with Sophie and I with our management classes, which is you just do it as a matter of business. You don't necessarily display it. But when people ask questions, I mean, you really need to be ready to answer them. And so that's a shift in marketing, if you will, for us, and putting the information out there so people in the community know, yes, we are aware and we are taking these steps. Again, in the past, it was just something we did, but now we're beginning to realize we have to market differently. I think that's a weakness for us. We are confused about keeping a diversity database. Again, in the past, that was taboo. You didn't keep a diversity database. But as we are growing and learning, like I said, we're being forced to expand our minds, and we're interested in that if we understand how it's applied and how we collect that information. And I think there is value to it. But again, it's a weakness that we have to explore, not only institutionally to have those tools in place, but in our mindsets as well. Some opportunities that are out there, we definitely can become a regional leader in DEI initiatives and talking points, particularly when it comes to municipal government. And I think when we look at some of the more looked at points like public safety or parks and recreation, some of those other areas, there's no reason that we can't share our experiences as we grow and learn, and Orono becomes a plank holder in these initiatives within municipal government. I know there's talk about it out there now, but I'm going to be honest with you, what I've heard so far really doesn't speak to me as a public safety director, and it's hard for me to communicate down the chain to public safety people below me who need to make that connection. So I think this is an opportunity for us to learn how to communicate that message out better so that it's better received. Again, understanding that it's going to require a change of mind. This is 100% an adaptive change in people's mindset. Like I said, it's because it's not what we've been taught, but I think there's a real chance there. The opportunities for us to learn are tremendous. Like I said, this is going to require learning for us in general. But I think as we start to learn and work more with the university and explore opportunities there, I just think the learning that we're going to get out of it can be tremendous. I think that there are opportunities for us to further collaborate with the University of Maine and the LBT Q2 LBT the LBT LGBTQ2SIA plus community. Sorry, but I knew I was going to stumble on that. I think that there's an opportunity out there for us to collaborate with them. We are looking at bringing in some training within the Orono Fire Department that Sophie will talk about, I think, in a little bit. Going back again to the trans community and ways that we can provide service better to them in the back of the ambulance, just in general. And I think that the council should really look at expanding accreditation where they can beyond the police department. Right now, you have the police department that is accredited, which ensures that they follow best practices. And as DEI initiatives gain more steam, I think that the requirements for DEI and some of the other issues that we looked at, like use of force and those types of things, will become more important to that accreditation process. I can tell you that in the fire service, they're already becoming important, where we have a cultural and diversity work group at the international fire chiefs level that is pushing down information to us. I think that if we were to look at accreditation for fire, for public works, perhaps if there's some process for the library or parks and rec, I think number one, it shows that we are forward thinking. It shows that we are annually putting effort into our policies to make sure that they are done appropriately. And it's a third party organization, much like law enforcement, that takes a look at our work and says, you know, you guys are on the right track, or you're really kind of messing up here. These are things that you should consider their industry best practices. Just a recommendation. Of course, there's cost with all of that. So, but I think it's something that should probably be looked at. Some of the threats, there are certainly a considerable number of threats that are out there. I think probably the biggest one right now is the community perception that we aren't doing anything. And frankly, for municipal government to take this on without a dedicated person who is knowledgeable steering this is a significant task to take on and to drive. It took me probably 2 weeks, and I had to speak with a counselor to understand that I could put this into a SWOT format, because I had no idea how to compile all this information or how to convey it in a way that was reasonable. And even to get to that, it took us probably 30 minutes in a meeting to finally get it into my little pea fireman brain. But we were able to work through it, and you have the product that's in front of you. So it's not that there's a lack of action. It's that it's difficult, and it takes time because there's a learning process for us that are doing. Delivering training, you know, you can schedule a trainer or whatever the case may be, and they come in and do talks and those types of things. But to really do a review and to do interviews and stuff like that as a part-time position for the town, or as one of my functions anyway, it's difficult. The other thing is our community demographic, I think, really drives complacency. And that goes back to a weakness that we have, where we don't necessarily understand all the challenges that are out there. If you're not exposed to the things that other people are experiencing, or they're not communicated to you on a regular basis, it's easy to imagine they don't exist, or to not acknowledge them as a priority. And that's not right, but unfortunately it's human nature. And when we can, we want to be complacent. And I don't think that's what we want to do in this town. I really do think we want to take a leading role. You know, we want to highlight some of the issues that we see out there.
Yeah.
Jeff, can I just stop you for just a second? When you talk about threats as a category, what's the difference between threats and weaknesses, or threats and challenges? Like, why is threats a category?
So weaknesses are directed internally. So when we talk about weaknesses, we're talking about things that we see inside as weaknesses. When we talk about threats come from the outside. So for example, when I talked about community perception and lack of action, that's a threat because it's coming from the outside. The community sees that, and it creates a threat to the organization as we're trying to improve and do better. And it can really create havoc if we're not on top of it. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you for that.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Some of the others, I don't want to dig too deep into these. Certainly they're in front of you there, but being overwhelmed by the negative is a threat. There's a lot of negative press and a lot of negative discussion around DEI initiatives, and they can really overwhelm groups when they're trying to make changes or adjust to those types of things. And it can really be a barrier to trying to get, I don't want to say compliant, but trying to get buy-in from staff or just the organization in general. So that's that overwhelming negativity that can exist can certainly be a threat to us. Lack of trust in the accuracy of the information available is another one. Depending on what media outlet you listen to, on what day, you never know what you're going to have for information coming at you. And it's very difficult for people who are trying to make changes internally to buy in when you just don't have a reliable source of information. And I don't know how to overcome that. I think it's just the way it is. And I think it's going to be up to the council to say, this is what we want to do. And then we'll pick up and run the ball from there. The media or whatever information sources be damned. This is the direction we're headed for. And then the last big one that I would point out to you is the perception that local government has more authority to control DEI related matters than it actually does. Local government has very little control over a lot of the issues that were brought up, especially in the ad hoc committee's report. I appreciate everything the ad hoc committee had to say, and they are definitely valuable things, but things like diversion or alternative sentencing for crimes, town of Orono has no control over that, other than to say, we support alternative sentencing, or we support diversion, those types of things. We can come out as a police department, or as the public safety director, or as the council, and make a statement saying, yes, we support those things. But all the Orono Police Department is a gateway into the criminal justice system. Whatever happens after that is up to the district attorney's office or the attorney general's office or the state legislature who sets the statutes for those types of things. So that is that's the 30,000 foot view of this report. I know Sophie has some initiatives that she wants to talk to you about. If you have any questions about anything that I did or any of the bullets in here or how I got to what I got to, feel free to ask. This is my first run at something like this, and I have to be honest with you, it was a challenge for me. Not an unappreciated challenge. I really appreciate the opportunity and the experience, but it was definitely a challenge. So, Sophie, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Well, in the report, there are almost 3 pages of bullet points of things that the town is currently doing, has underway. And I'm not going to go through and read each one of those individually, other than to say, I would echo Jeff's statements about our lack of success in touting what we do. Just in general, that is not a normal municipal approach to much of anything. So we're working at that. Some of what I learned from the ad hoc committee's report and listening to a couple of their meetings was that things have truly shifted. 10 years ago when I got here, the town website was fairly new. It had just been revamped and everybody was excited that you could actually get video from council meetings. And now you can get video from council meetings through YouTube, which would be closed captioned, auto-generated, but generally pretty good. We use that website quite frequently. However, every little thing that we do is not on there. And statements of values We're not on there. This website was designed to be, want to know how to register your car, click here. You want to see an observer, click here. It was more of a data gathering place. If you go on now, Bell has been hard at work with the first lay-in of some DEI work. So that has been a little bit different, and it would give you a picture of where we plan to go with other pieces of the work. I've also been doing a lot of training around the DEI efforts as it relates to HR. And with the HR work, one of the things I am finding is that there are two approaches from a workforce perspective with DEI. One is to swing for a home run and just try to do everything all at once. The other is to try to move the needle consistently. A little bit, set a defined goal and try to meet that goal. That's the approach that I have been taking with staff, because I think, for example, one of the things that Jeff acknowledged that we're working on right now is our hiring practice. We've got a hiring practice training that I hope to bring in for key staff later on this calendar year. We've got to kind of wait for the coffers to refill a little bit to be able to do that. But we're doing things like reviewing job descriptions. If it's not really required and it's always just been on there because it's been nice to have, it could be a barrier for somebody coming in. A driver's license, as an example. Not everybody can get a driver's license. Written tests as part of promotional processes. We have people who have learning disabilities that might not be the best thing to include. We are working on, so hiring is one of our primary things we're looking at as we go into looking at job requirements, residency requirements. We don't have any, other than me, there is no requirement that anybody live within the town of Orono, but we have had response requirements. And so now we're looking at, is that absolutely necessary? If we call somebody, do they need to be here within a certain amount of time? Or is that just because it's always been that way? Improving the area that we can draw candidates from, especially if we can get further into southern Maine, may allow for a more diverse candidate pool, at least to start. We are, I belong to and have been learning lots with the Diversity Hiring Coalition of Maine, which is why that hiring stuff is kind of front and center. We're also looking at the website and trying to make changes to make it easier for citizens to make we don't call them complaints, to tell us how we're doing. And I think the ability to click a button and to say, this is my experience and I'm not happy, or I really think that you should think about X, makes a big difference. I also think, Jeff is working right now on a document that will lay in on the police department website. We have a lot of people that are talking about 8 can't wait. And when you look at 8 can't wait, it didn't wait in Orono, and some of those it didn't wait in Orono years and years ago. So the plan is to kind of take the elements of the things that people really are looking for and formalize those in a place that people will immediately see. The police department has been a focal point and continues to be a focal point in the ad hoc committee's report around demilitarization and defunding. And I think the council will deal with budgetary issues, but the demilitarization piece has been informal council policy for a long time. I would never bring a request for a tank or assault weaponry to council. Training, we do a lot of training. As you talk to Jeff, we've got a lot more in process. We are working very hard to bring an individual who was in the public safety field for years and years and has just transitioned, still in public service, to come and talk about what that experience and to kind of relate it will be, which I think will be really good. When we look at next steps, thinking in that move the needle as opposed to hit a home run, I think for staff to continue adopting best practices for supporting an inclusive and diverse hiring process, to continue the staff training and development of policies and procedures that support those best practices. We're going to continue to work on the website because, again, what we're hearing is if it's not on the website, we probably aren't doing it. And then one of our biggest roles moving forward is going to be to support the town council in its policymaking process. I think when you look, we've got pages of the little things that we're doing. What we really could use from the council at this point is the general policy and priority of the DEI process. When you look, we spend a lot of time comparing ourselves to cities, whether it's the city of South Portland, the city of Lewiston, Boulder, Colorado, Burlington, Vermont, Seattle, Austin, Texas. That's just a few that we've all sat around the table and compared us to. Those are very large communities compared to little old Orono, Maine. And I think I don't have the resources, and I don't think, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but given the conversations we've had with council about resources in the past, whether they be staff or budgetary, just pure expense, I think it would be very helpful to understand council's priorities so that we can then lay in a path to meet those priorities and be able to tell you what we think things will cost. When we look, these are the proposed council next steps to identify the priorities that we could then help draft a framework of a plan that we really, next week, we're going to come back with the document that Megan worked on that staff and I have also kind of had an editing hand in that helps kind of create a framework for evaluating policy and procedure with that equity lens. Council was given a report, and you had talked about a desire for more conversation around the formulation of an advisory group to provide guidance to council. The only comment that or input that staff would have with that is, however the council wishes to move forward with that, it would be important that there's a very clearly defined scope. So what is that? What is the charge of that group? What are the expectations? And how does that integrate with the current organizational structure? If I learned anything during the ad hoc committee process, we had a group of very excited, intelligent, forward-thinking individuals on that committee, and it was totally disconnected from staff. And moving forward, the one thing I would strongly suggest is that we continue to mirror the practice that the council has had, at least in the decade I've been here, where staff is at the table and collaborates in providing technical assistance and information about how policies might impact operations. I think the idea of surveying the community is a good one. I've watched the city of South Portland has gone through a formal survey process. Their survey is a statistically relevant survey that can crunch data and gave them an awful lot of good information on where they should be perhaps doubling down and working for services. It was a general survey, so I'm suggesting that we look into the National Community Survey process. It's a format that you have multiple standard questions, and then on top of that, you can add, they walk you through after meetings with you, custom questions. So when we tell them what we want to know about, and they create a question that is not leading, that is going to produce good data. So that sounds great. And then it all ties into, I also think council needs to identify the resources that council is willing and able to allocate to support the town's DEI efforts. For example, we are making great use of a professional trainer. This is a very hot line of work, and it's not cheap. To continue using this trainer in the way that we're using them, we would look at an annual training cost of between $10,000 and $15,000 a year for DEI. Totally doable if I have a budget for them. If I don't have the budget, I would look at doing more train the trainer and subjecting line staff to a more basic diversity, cultural competency training annually. The NCS study alone would cost about $15,000 to develop and deploy. I need to do a little bit more research. I have not spoken with them. I spoke with the city manager in South Portland. And a faster rollout of the town's DEI initiative is possible, but it would require reprioritization of existing staff time or adding additional staff or consultant time. I think Mitch is famous for saying, you can have it good, you can have it fast, or you can have it cheap, you can pick two.
Well,
And I think that is, spot on, that I would loathe to not have a good product because it's almost not worth doing. So I'm really in the camp of it could be faster, it could be cheap. And right now we're doing it cheap. And if council is good with rolling out bits and pieces, then we can continue in this vein. The last bullet that I would add that's not on the report that I will add to the report is I really think council needs to have a conversation about some policies around the consideration of collecting demographics in service. So what do we think about that? Because a hit or miss approach probably isn't going to give good data. And how do we feel about asking community members for that? Is that a good thing? The state just adopted a demographic collection requirement for the police department, and it's all based on what they think. They are incredibly uncomfortable with making judgment. And so I would prefer to try to keep us out of the the deputy clerk just waited on somebody and I think they're a female and I think this, I don't, I think we have to give that some thought. And I know that Val is doing some research right now into what other places are doing.
We can't use census data.
So we absolutely can, but that doesn't tell us who we are seeing in the fire department. So I can't tell you that we saw 15 people last month who identified as transgender and we didn't get any complaints, or we got one, to put things into perspective. And so I think that's where we have to decide. It was interesting when last week we had a conversation, or last time we met, we had a conversation about council pay, and it turned into an equity conversation. And I went home and did some brainstorming, and met back with the team that you voluntold to meet together, and said, wait a minute, I think we're going at this wrong. It shouldn't be what we think. It should be based on the best data that's available. And so Lori Carpenter and I had started doing a literature review, found some very interesting information, but I reached out to Rob Glover in the political science and honors college and asked, hey, do you have any information that may inform that? Now we've got people at Colby and Duke coming back to us with information in a bit. So it seems to me that being as fact-based, information-based databases we can would follow the model that we try to use. But it also seems like we're on a learning curve, and sometimes it will have to be what people think, and that works too. So I know that Lori Osher has her hand up.
Yeah, I didn't know, I couldn't see the side,
Yeah,
so I could tell.
it's a blind
Lori,
spot.
Lori, I didn't see the attendees on the side, so I didn't see somebody informing me your hand was up. Do you still need to speak?
My hand was up when our public safety director was giving his great description of the work he'd been doing and telling us to refer to a piece of paper and a report, and I didn't get that report. So that was, but Bill has sent it to me, so I'm good. But I do want to thank him for really making it clear how much work you've put in and what the challenges were in just even getting started, and appreciate all that you did to put the work report together. Thank you.
Can I just ask too, so in a national spotlight, and I know, that, like you said, it doesn't always apply to us, but environmental justice is getting a lot of public speak. And there really isn't anything in this tool that has to do with zoning or land use or things like that, as far as equity and as far as diversity and equity and
So,
creating policy, I guess.
so I would,
Is that something you might be interested in?
I think that goes in with the next steps of identifying the policy priorities. This was, for me, Jeff and I were not approaching this as policy priorities. This was about, from an operations standpoint, where we think the holes are, where we think the opportunities are, what we're doing right now.
Right.
I think the place that you will begin to see, I think, more conversations about that is as we begin to address the toolkit, which has policy and operational kind of checklist and questions to ask as we look at things. Right now, we are not doing a lot of environmental justice. However, from a best practices standpoint, we are getting more and more information about how we should be looking at zoning and how we should be looking at some of the other things that we do.
And I think it's pertinent to our area because of the river, because we're right on the wastewater treatment plant. There's a whole legislative, the ENR committee is meeting about PFAS and wastewater treatment plants and things like that. So, and also the Penobscot Nation. So yes, I think we're positioned, but whether, but we don't really have that much.
And I will go back to, just because I say it doesn't mean it's what happened, right? It's just in my brain how it should work. When you talk about PFAS and wastewater pollution control,
Right.
that is really outside of our general domain. And I think one of the things that can happen, and it's easy to get caught up in, even at the staff level, is what's happening at the state level or the national level.
Yeah.
And I will say, to do that, to tackle those issues at the local level with all of the local issues that we're responsible for, I think it begins to make it so big Cheryl.
Yeah.
I think when we look, and I think Kyle will be able to walk us through inclusionary zoning and ways that we should be looking to support all of the demographic of the community, socioeconomic demographic of the community in what we do for things like we don't charge people fines in the library for books, late books anymore, because it hits the people, folks who don't have cars to just drop their book off and might need to arrange that, or conversations I hope we can have about, is it worthwhile for us to go ahead and keep charging for day things at the pool? And does it make more sense, if we can't afford everything, to maybe not do ice cream at the pool, so that we don't have to have somebody up there who can handle money, and it's just lifeguards and stuff like that.
Right.
I will say that so I see a mixing of the layers of government, but I also see a mixing across operations where, if you look in some of the reports, everything is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. From a council perspective, as we get going, one of the things that might be interesting for you guys to look at is, when we look at infrastructure right now, we say, is it falling apart? How much is it used? How much will it cost us if we wait for a year? Rod has a very defined matrix of how to decide what gets put where on the capital plan. Nowhere in there are we talking about some of the things that the ad hoc committee talked about. We know that when we do a project and it comes up on the list and needs to be done, that one of our goals is to exceed the Americans with Disabilities Act. But if somebody can't use it now, but it's not bad enough, we're not really doing anything with it. So I think we want to talk a little bit from a policy standpoint of how we want to deal with that. But I guess my first question is this the information that you guys were looking for? Have I missed anything that you were looking for?
Well, this is actually a great start. I want to keep in my head too, that I think it's important to recognize that we are not in Austin, a Boston, and I think that we find ourselves a lot of times using those as examples. Look at this place. Well, we don't have the staff. They get probably separate staff that are paid specifically to deal with this. So we're doing the best we can to address what we need to address and move forward. Is it going to be the silver bullet? It's going to be like one and done? No. It's going to be a process, and I think that we can do it, but it's just everybody's going to have to be a little bit more patient as we work through there. Does anybody have anything to ask of Jeff or Sophie from this? Not we'll obviously next week we'll kind of delve more into stuff, but just from this initial document.
I just think it's been a great background, giving us an idea of current status and a look at what some future priorities could be. I appreciate the work that was done on it.
Can I ask if we have a report from the ad hoc, and we have this report. I haven't seen any work where we set up a matrix and say, these are the 10 recommendations or 50 items that were identified under those 10 recommendations, and these are the specific actions that the town has already taken, right?
You want to take these two and
Yeah, I mean,
just like outlines of them, so like at the
So-
executive level, right? So take the ad hoc committee's
well, the ad hoc-
report
yeah, in
and
their,
blend this in.
so in their report, they identify 10 recommendations in just sort of bullet form. And then they expand these 10 recommendations, so that each recommendation has a number of bullets underneath it. Those bullets tend to be the actionable items. So what what we know when we see the operations of the town is that a lot of those actionable items are ongoing. Right, but we have no instrument to compare.
So, yeah, so Jeff, that was in part intentional, in that staff does not have any right to or have an opinion on an advisory committee. We can have opinions on things like, one of the things they talked about with their advisory committee when they gave the presentation was wanting to take citizen complaints against employees. That would put us in real legal jeopardy. There are reasons why I would say that might not be a great idea.
But sorry. Wouldn't it be useful then to have an instrument that says, these are the 50 things we've identified. Here's the ones we're doing. Here's the ones that we aspire to do. Here's the ones that are off the table for us. Then that's something concrete that we could share, because one of the things that I've heard from members of this community, and other members of this committee and other members of the community, is that since this, I mean, it's just, you know, the wheels of government turn pretty slowly, right? I mean, people are like chomping at the bit to get information, and we want to share with them.
So I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to do that. I intentionally did not do that at the beginning. Partly because we had residents that worked hard and volunteered their time, and I did not want to take their report and say, but, you didn't talk to staff, but, this is way too much money, but you can't do this, or we already do this, or that felt not very nice. And so I see what you're saying, and I think we have a report. I can take what we say in that report and try to create a box for you that simply says, item 1, here are the things in progress, concern, you know, legally might not be an idea. This will potentially cost, to have an interpreter at every meeting would cost X number of dollars, that kind of stuff. Try to keep it. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, and I don't even think we need to quote prices. I think, in fact, that's a discussion that the council should have, right? I mean, at some point, we're gonna have to sit down and look at all the needs that are not met, that were a recommendation of our committee, and say, well, are these things that we even want to like look at more closely? I'm so appreciative of this report, because this is the first time that, like, I really think that the people who've been waiting to hear from us are hearing from us. And I think this is a great step. I'm glad Cheryl mentioned the word threats, because I'm not sure that we're threatened by the outside. I think we're challenged by them or spurred to action by them or something.
It's a typical
Yeah.
municipal analytical tool is the SWOT.
But yeah, I think it would be helpful to respond to people's concerns if we had something that said, we hear what you told us way back 6 months ago, and this is where we are.
So I think that should come from council. But I can set you up to have that conversation with a matrix that compares the two reports.
That would be helpful.
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, and I just want to, I want to jump in and just say that, you know, and I'm really appreciative of this report that Chief Lowe and Sophie put together. When we when we met in the fall, so I had started work on and completed work on a toolkit, and because that was one of my tasks over the summer, the spring and the summer was to create something when I set out to do it, the goal was to create something that council could use as a policy guide to, you know, kind of weather test what the actions that we were taking to see, like, are we being as inclusive as possible? Are we making sure to think about equity when we're making policy? And as I started to dig into the research of what bigger, better funded cities are doing, it became very clear very quickly that the overlap between policy and operations when it comes to these kinds of toolkits, you couldn't separate them. So when I drafted the toolkit and sent it to Sophie and to Tom, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that the thing that was kind of missing from the ad hoc committee let me just back up and say, like, there was a lot of community pressure to create a committee, and I don't regret doing that. I think we learned some valuable things, and I'm very appreciative of the time that people invested into that. It's giving us a good starting point. But the thing that was missing from that process is that technical guidance from staff. So the committee was putting out recommendations without the technical expertise or understanding to know whether this was something that was possible or legal, or that municipal government was in charge of that particular thing, or that we may have already been doing it in some capacity. So they were operating to the best of their ability, but without crucial information that comes from staff. And that's one of the huge disconnects in this process, is that there has been a lot of public criticism of staff. There has been council criticism of staff. There is, and then there's been sort of a disconnect between this process that we're trying to move forward and the people who are going to enact it on the day-to-day in operations. And that has been a huge failing on our part, I think. And so presenting this toolkit to Tom and to Sophie, it was like, okay, well, let's hit pause on this toolkit, because the first thing that needs to happen is this toolkit needs to go to staff to have a chance to look at it from the operations standpoint. And so Chief and Sophie and I had a meeting about all of that, and then they went off and have created this really comprehensive report about staff operations, and the opportunities and the, you know, the weaknesses and all of the things that we are already doing and that we will continue to do ongoing. So I'm really excited about this document, because it's finally getting to the thing that's been missing all along, which is that council driving the policy and staff enacting the operations. Like, we have to be working together and on the same page to get anything done, because the way that we're actually going to affect real change in real people's lives and their experience of living in this community is through the minutia of the little things that we're tweaking here, there, and everywhere. So council's driving the policy that's making that happen, but it's going to be our line staff, you know, making these little adjustments to how they do their jobs that's going to end up impacting people's lives out in the community. So I'm very excited about this document. And Jeff, I will say that in the meeting, I did also bring up the same point of like, well, why don't we go through the committee's report and say, hey, we can't do this, that's not legal. Or, hey, this isn't something that municipal government does, that's state government. And hey, we are already doing this. And hey, this would cost way too much money, we could never do it. And I understand Sophie's point to, like, I don't think necessarily that the right approach would be to come out and say, like, it would seem antagonistic, I think. And I don't think that that's helpful in the process. But I do think it's important for council to directly address the recommendations. But what we didn't ask for before, but we have now, is the technical guidance to be set up to have that conversation. So I'm hopeful that when we can look at that kind of a matrix and also start to bring in this toolkit that I've drafted, that we can get to making some concrete recommendations to move this all forward.
Lori, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you. I actually, I'm so grateful to the whole process. I think it's wonderful that we had people come in and be a committee that advised us as a council, and from their expertise and their experience, And my understanding of how municipal government is supposed to work is that the council is at a is more in the philosophical range. Like we talk about the big picture and the staff has to make things work. And so I feel like this is it's been the right process, which is the people who came in and advised us, they were looking at the very big picture. And so that, and the staff does a fabulous job of doing whatever tasks are before them. And this is a huge change. As the chief said, there was a whole different way of perceiving how treating everyone equally was the positive goal, without a lot of embedded discussion about how people do not show up equally because of the way our culture has some challenges in seeing everyone equally. So I'm really appreciative of the process, and it's of course important for the staff to weigh in on those goals that the committee gave us, or their suggestions. And so thank you very much, Councilor Wingard, for suggesting that we get what you called a matrix, and that does make a lot of sense to me. I just had a question back from last time I had my hand up, I forgot to ask it, which, Sophie, when you were speaking, you were very clear for the most part, but we are on Zoom and some things I missed. And there was one thing you said twice that it sounded like you were saying 8 won't wait, or 8 can't wait. But I assume it was talking about hate can't wait. But when I did a Control F to look in the document, I didn't see that anywhere. So can you explain what that was, or maybe I missed what the words were that you were saying?
You did not miss the words. It's 8 can't wait. It's a campaign that activists have put together to bring around immediate change in police departments. It is the national narrative and what we hear a lot. And when Josh was here, he was talking with people a lot about a perception that we have not adopted 8 can't wait, therefore we are not sensitive. The 8 are banning chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring de-escalation, requiring a warning before shooting, exhausting all other alternatives before shooting, a duty to intervene, banning shooting at moving vehicles, requiring a use of force continuum, and requiring comprehensive reporting. So it's a tagline that a lot of people who are looking for change in police departments would expect to see those specific words. And the way Maine works, we don't necessarily use those words, but we follow almost all of that in policy. Okay, so that wasn't part of the DEI, that was a separate, there's not in the. If you look at the DEI report, when they talk about continue reform of the police department, defund the police department, and demilitarize the police department, that is all coming from that national narrative. Okay, thank you. All right, and then the other, that's all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lori. Anybody else have any additional thoughts? So next week.
I will work on a matrix. We'll see what we can come up with for you.
We'll delve into this further. So I'm done, and moving on to Dr. Tom.
We have a town manager's report, which is listed on the agenda, or?
The town manager's report is not as important as getting done with the meeting.
Then we will close our committee meeting, and we'll move on to a special council meeting. And we'll again show the roll call shows that Councilor Grenier, Councilor Wingard, Councilor Robertson, Councilor Perry are here in chambers, and Councilor Osher and Councilor Gardner are joining us via Zoom. And under new business, we have order 22-1-18, order adopting a community resilient partnership resolution. But I have a motion to approve this, and then we'll have some discussion. And second, please.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Sophie, is that you?
I'm gonna make it me, just to see if we can do it quickly.
Yep.
We were in front of town council at the last regular meeting in a workshop talking about the community resilience program. We had a nice presentation by Megan Hess, our environmental services coordinator, about climate change and this grant program. The state of Maine is encouraging planning and action steps with regard to implementing elements of Maine Won't Wait, which is the climate action plan. When we talked, Megan walked you through kind of some of the potential opportunities of that grant program. We would like, so we finished the resilient self-assessment with the Environment Committee on the 26th of January. We have a list of actions at this point. The two actions that we are most interested in trying to move forward are around the idea of weatherization and electrification. Electrification would include trying to transition the municipal fleet where appropriate to electric, creating the infrastructure for the community to be able to use electric vehicles, so charging stations here, and installing heat pumps in town properties, trying to get away from some of the fossil fuel. The resolution that you have in front of you, while I would love to take credit for the wordsmithing, is right from the state with a couple of plugins for Orono, and it's required, and then there were ones I could pick that made sense. So in order to qualify to participate in the program, we would have to send this in along with our self-assessment.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Pretty straightforward. You ready to vote on this?
Counselor Berry,
In favor?
Counselor Gardner,
In favor?
Counselor Osha,
In favor?
Counselor Robertson,
In favor.
Counselor Greeley,
In favor?
and Counselor Whitmore.
In favor.
And the vote is 6 in favor and none opposed.
Thank you, Nancy. Moving on to order 22-19, order authorizing the town manager to apply for the Bureau of Highway Safety grant funds in the amount of $4,200 with no local match required, accepting any funds awarded, and further authorizing the town manager to expend said funds for drug recognition expert training, along with related travel and incurred overtime expense. Again, could I have a motion to approve this, please?
Move approval.
And a second. Thank you. Jeff or Sophie, I'm not
I'm
sure.
gonna take
or-
a stab at this, and Dan's gonna correct me if I go astray. Especially with the advent of legalized marijuana, drug recognition expert has become a skill that is much in demand in this region, and most definitely within the town of Orono. We had multiple drug recognition experts with staff turnover. We are down to one. And we really feel like it's important to build that back. That's not something that you would send half your department out to get. That training is highly specialized and not often available within the state of Maine. So we would like to apply to the Bureau of Highway Safety, there we go, for $4,200 in grant funding. Our match to this is our in-kind of the officer's salary, while the officer is at training. Dan would use the tools that he would normally use to select the appropriate person to send to training. The grant, this is a little wonky. It includes 40 hours of call-out time because, number one, in order to get your certification and maintain it, you have to get called a certain number of times to go do what you're doing. We also would be a regional resource, just like another department has accident reconstruction people that we would use. This kind of becomes our contribution to the community. So the state would pay up to 40 hours of call-out time at current salary rates. Did I miss anything, Dan?
No, I think she covered it perfectly. A lot of it is projected numbers. So the $4,200, like she said, is we may not use 40 hours of call out time, but we're going to request from the state money that could cover up to that amount. And any funds that we don't use, we would obviously turn back to them. And the same thing with the grant for training travel. Our officer has to go to Jacksonville, Florida for approximately 4 days. So they're projecting what the costs would be for flights, hotels, and meals, but using the same matrix that we would if we go traveling anywhere, which is the government standard rates of meals and hotels and things like that. So all that structure is provided to us from the state of Maine if we're able to accept the grant.
Thank you, Dan. Any questions or comments on this item?
Can I ask just a crazy question? Besides recognizing drugs, what does a drug recognition person do?
When somebody is pulled over
Yeah,
or they arrive at the scene of an accident, if somebody is under the influence of alcohol, you smell it, there are key indicators that there's a deficiency happening. And there's a whole field sobriety process that then gets capped off with a blood or breath test. With drug recognition, we use that because if it's not alcohol and they are impaired because they're high, it is a whole different level of expertise to be able to get the background that you would need in order to move that case forward. So when you think about it, we can't just pull anybody over. It's against the law. Oftentimes with our stops, it would be because somebody is operating a vehicle in a way that is unsafe. So, but it doesn't work just because you think so. You have to have a piece of paper after.
okay.
Any other questions, comments? Ready for a vote? Thank you, Nancy, for a roll call vote.
Council Perry,
In favor?
Council Gardner,
In favor?
Council Osha,
In favor?
Council Robertson,
In favor.
Council Junior,
In favor?
Council Whitcomb.
In favor.
The vote is 6 in favor and there are none.
Thank you. And order 22-20, order authorizing the town manager to apply for a federal emergency management agency FEMA staffing for adequate fire and emergency response safer grant.
Move approval.
And a second.
Second.
Okay. And Ms. Sophie?
I'm gonna start out and Chief and Deputy Chief Sirwa are here to help me if I go astray. So we've been in front of council several times in the last, well, many times since I've been here to talk about concerns related to overtime in the fire department. One of the things that we suggested and did 6 months ago was we came to you and asked if we could have a floater to help defray some of the ongoing overtime expense. That floater finally is hired and on staff, and we are finally to a point where we can use a floater, which will be kind of interesting to see how things move forward. The plan that we brought to you several times is this idea that if our costs are such that it is at or less expensive to fill our hours with a regular staff person versus paying for overtime, makes sense to look at, should we bring people on. I asked Deputy Chief Sirwa has really dove into this, and I asked him and Chief Lowe to talk about or to find what is the staffing level that we would need to be able to find enough savings that long-term this would make sense. They ran this with 2 people with floaters, and floaters don't make sense across 4 ships because of the way you have to schedule them. However, having 6 people on a shift and dropping to 5 makes more financial sense for us. And we laid that out in the background for you. We actually, we took out the 2,400 hours of overtime that are associated with the long-term workers' comp claim this year, and we're left with 56 hours of overtime this year. Counselor Perry, astute as he always is, said, how much of that is COVID related? And so that's why you have the chart in front of you where we're saying this is calendar year to calendar year. That's how we track overtime in the fire department. We had about 1,400 hours of COVID and another 5,400 hours of overtime. One of the, in addition to that. I'm sorry, 1,400 hours of COVID is part of that. The workers' comp is not part of that, Tom. So one of the things that I asked, because in 2019, we went way up, and then 2020, we hit COVID. In 2021, we also were in COVID. So if you look at that, we went from 6,100 overtime hours down to about 4,300 overtime hours, down to about 4,000 overtime hours. When we look at that, one of the questions I had for Chief was, are you seeing the same level of vacation time in the pandemic? So are we taking the same level of, are all the apples kind of together? And what Chief is saying is we are not seeing the same level of vacation time. People are not taking as much vacation time during the pandemic. I have to dig into that more. That's something that I asked late this afternoon. So I think the numbers are pretty consistent. And I would expect them to go up from 18 to 19 because we added the 4th shift and more people, which it's another whole shift to cover. So what we are asking.
So I'm sorry, Sophie, can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I don't have anything in my packet, and I don't have anything on the drive that reflects this conversation. Do counselors in chambers have like a?
They do, and
Should have been here.
I'm sorry. Let me just look real quick. I might be able to get it out to you.
Okay, that's okay. I mean, I'm following along. I might like to look at things.
I'm getting better at this, but I don't know that I told Zach that you needed it. Yeah, could you do that? Mitch is gonna take a picture and email it to you. Yes, please.
Would you email it to me too, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
So staff looked at the overtime. They looked at our average overtime rate. And when you look at calendar year over calendar year, based on the 3-year average, we're looking at $192,000 a year in overtime costs. Some of that is budgeted. It will go over. Last year and fiscal year 20, we went over fire department budget by about $55,000. This year, we're looking at closer to $100,000. They took the idea of 3 additional staff people to bring us up to 6 people on each shift, so we could drop 1 person before we had to incur any overtime on any shift any day. We think, based on those numbers, Deputy Chief is expecting to have to fill about 235 shifts a year. So considerable number. 64% of the time, we're filling shifts to make that minimum staffing. To go from 4 to 5. So his calculation based on that, and using an estimate of 80% reduction in the overtime cost if we had 6 people on, he thinks that we could, he's calculating, he doesn't just think, he's calculating that the town could save as much as $153,000 a year. So one of the comments that our fearless leader, Council Chair Perry, made at the last time we talked about SAFER was, we have great ideas and then we think it's going to work out one way, and we don't even get to try it out, and it never seems to work when it comes to fire department staffing. And I will tell you, he's not necessarily wrong. What we're seeing is the SAFER grant being an opportunity for us to have 3 years to collect the data using this methodology, getting 100% of today's cost for all 3 people paid by the federal government. So there would be the increment of the increase in costs, but it is pretty minuscule. We think if it comes through the way he has calculated, the wages and benefits in today's dollars would cost about $215,000 total. It's about $71,000 a person. If the savings comes through the way that we believe it will, we would have an increase in the budget of approximately $61,000. Take the overtime out and you add the 3 bodies. So we're here asking to be able to use the SAFER grant as an opportunity to see the benefits that we could gain. Given our staffing turnover, as of what we're seeing, if we got 2 years into this and we're not seeing the savings within 2 years, we could absorb these folks through attrition.
Questions or comments from council?
I assume I hit it. I don't know if I missed anything from the team.
Deputy Chief or Public Safety Director, anything that you'd like to add to this discussion?
No, I think for me anyway, Sophie summarized it really well.
What's the question about COVID hours in our ARPA funds? Are those, do we get reimbursed at all? Or can any of that money be used to cover those? I mean, I didn't realize how many COVID hours were there until
So
now.
many of those COVID hours,
Yeah.
we will be able to get reimbursement for. Bell has been right on top of FEMA. We can move ARPA to cover any reimbursed, non-reimbursed hours. I would wait until we see what FEMA will do.
Questions, comments? What are you thinking, folks?
I think it's great to try it, especially since
Yeah.
we can absorb projectively these folks if things go awry.
But just be understanding that after 2 years, if it's not working, to back out.
For me, being able to do that in a way that isn't cutting the position is important.
Bacon or Laurie, anything you'd like to add?
I don't know, I said a lot about this last time and I still feel exactly the same way.
Yeah, I'm supportive.
Excuse me.
That you can support.
We ready for a vote? Nancy, please.
Council Perry,
Favor.
Council Gardner,
In favor?
Council Osher,
In favor?
Council Robertson,
In favor.
Council Green,
In favor?
and Council Wingard.
In favor.
The vote is 6 in favor and there are none opposed.
Thank you, Nancy. So that concludes our open meeting business, I believe. There we go. And now we are going to have an executive session pursuant to 1 MRSA 405-6D for discussion related to negotiation of collective bargaining agreement with IAFF Local 3106 and Maine Association of Police Orono Unit. But I have a motion to go into executive session, and there will be no formal business after executive session.
Plan would be to
Just
cut
adjourn.
this speed and, yep.
Move approval.
Second, please. Thank you.
Program this thing.
All in favor of executive session? Do we have a, do we just raise our hands
No,
on
we
that?
gotta-
No, we gotta
have
do
to
a roll call. vote. All right,
Council Perry,
in favor.
Council Gardner,
In favor.
Council Osher,
In favor?
Council Robinson,
Yes, in favor.
Council Grenier,
In favor.
Council Wingard.
In favor.
And the vote is 6 in favor and there are none opposed.
Thank you very much.
So Belle's gonna shut this meeting down. She's gonna open up the meeting. I'm gonna log in and,
Right.
yes. Can you log? Yep. Can you log